Act 4, Our Man of Perpetual Sorrow. A lot of returns to the scenes of crimes are ones where somebody returns to some place where they really never wanted to be in the first place. Someplace they disliked, they disagreed with, and then they can't help themselves. They find they can't help themselves, they go back. It's a very weird thing. Well, Dan Savage has written books, all kinds of stuff about him and his boyfriend deciding to get married, and then deciding to adopt a little boy, not actually in that order. He made a name for himself writing a funny and deeply informed sex advice column called Savage Love. Please welcome Dan Savage.
Hello. The crime scene in this story, a Catholic church. In particular, St. Ignatius on Glenwood Avenue on the north side of Chicago. And yes, I went to Catholic grade schools, and yes, I was an altar boy. But no, the crime is not what you might think. No Catholic school children were physically harmed during the production of this story, so you can relax. I am not a practicing Catholic. I'm a lapsed Catholic, an agnostitheist, a sort of agnostic atheist hybrid, which means I cross myself on airplanes. I blew up once at a friend who thought it was funny to invert one of the crucifixes in my ironic collection of Catholic kitsch. And half the time when I take the Lord's name in vain, like when I mutter Jesus Christ through clenched teeth when my boyfriend passes someone going 90 miles an hour in a snowstorm, I am, in all honesty, seeking the protection of a higher power. I go right back to not believing in God once he's delivered us safely. I go right back to not believing in God once he's delivered us safely back to the right-hand lane, which makes me a hypocrite and an ingrate. I was raised in a deeply Catholic home. I went to the same Catholic grade school that my mother and grandmother did, St. Ignatius, and I had many of the same nuns as teachers. But by age 7, I was already having trouble reconciling loving Father with eternal damnation. But the fatal blow came at 14 with the realization that I was gay, something I figured out at roughly the same time I entered an all-male Catholic high school for boys thinking about becoming priests, which is a bit like realizing you're an alcoholic on your first day working at the Budweiser bottling plant. Luckily for my sanity, I didn't think, I'm going to hell. I thought, that can't be right. What the church, my church, is telling me about me, they're wrong. Soon I was contemplating the possibility that the church was wrong about other stuff, maybe lots of other stuff. The odds of virgin births, the virtues of celibacy, the evils of masturbation. It really didn't take long to arrive at the biggest doubt of all, the existence of God. And that was that. By senior year, I had started going to a public school and stopped going to church, except for the odd family wedding, baptism, or funeral, and they're all odd, aren't they? I go to church about as often as I go to Planned Parenthood for a pap smear. Then 12 months ago, my mother died. A virus can lay dormant in your body for so long that it's possible to forget you were ever infected. Then something happens that weakens your immune system, and the virus seizes its opportunity. For more than 2 decades, the Catholicism I'd contracted at St. Ignatius had lain dormant, manifesting itself only on airplanes and in passing lanes. But the immunity I'd long enjoyed was weakened by my mother's death. Because since that sunny, awful day in Tucson last spring, I found myself slipping into Catholic churches, not for weddings or funerals, but on totally random days of non-holy non-obligation. Tuesday afternoons, Friday mornings. And not just going to church, but going out of my way to go to church. There's a modernist Catholic chapel close to my office that won some big design award, but it looks like all modern churches do, like someone slapped a cross up on the wall in the rec room at the Brady House. St. James Cathedral in downtown Seattle is a much longer walk, but it looks like a Catholic church should. A lot like St. Ignatius, actually. Stained glass, marble, crowds of plaster saints everywhere. St. James is open for contemplation all day during the week. There are usually only one or two volunteers straightening up the hymnals and the offering envelopes in the backs of the pews when I arrive, both of them keeping an eye on the homeless people that come in to get out of the rain, and me. There's no music, few lights are on, and when a priest strolls through, he doesn't make eye contact with anyone. When my mother would call me with sad news, a relative I hadn't seen in years diagnosed with cancer, a friend with a desperately ill grandchild, she would always say, "I know you don't pray, Daniel, but keep them in your thoughts." My mom knew thoughts were the best I could do. And now at St. James, I sit in the bank of pews opposite a white marble statue of the Virgin Mother, stare into her face, and keep my mother in my thoughts. By her own estimation, my mother was a very good Catholic. She believed in Jesus, the resurrection, the virgin births, both of them, what are the odds? The Trinity, the sacraments. She believed that sex was sacred and that people, particularly people who have children, should be married to each other. But she didn't believe that being a good Catholic meant blind obedience, except to her. I guess you could say she was a good American Catholic. She believed that women should be priests, that priests should be able to marry, and after 4 pregnancies in 4 years, she concluded that birth control was not a sin. She prayed that the leaders of her church would one day come around, hopefully during her lifetime. Unfortunately, the church under the last 2 popes moved away from my mother. And whenever the current pope, Benny, she would call him, rolling her eyes, or the previous pope, JP2, whenever either of them condemned birth control or gay people or insisted that women could not and would not ever be ordained as priests, my mom would sigh and say, "It's like they're trying to make Lutherans of us all." But she refused to leave the church because she believed it was her church too, just as much as it was Benny's. A little voice inside her head said, "That can't be right. They're wrong." That voice, the same one I heard, somehow left her faith stronger. She took it hard when I came out. Her first impulse, when I told her that I was gay, was to call a priest. God bless Father Tom, who, when my mother, distraught, told him I had just come out to her, placed a hand on my mother's knee and came out to her himself. Thanks in part to good Catholics like Father Tom, my mother came around fast and came out swinging, rainbow stickers on her car, PFLAG membership, and an ultimatum delivered to the entire extended family. Anyone who had a problem with me had a much bigger problem with her. My mother was diagnosed with a degenerative lung condition 6 years ago. She had some bad years, but she was well enough last spring to drive down to the Southwest with her husband, my stepdad, to visit her sisters. She took a turn in Tucson where she was hospitalized for a week, but we thought she was going to pull through, as she had on several other occasions. Her doctors in Chicago, after all, had just given her 2 to 5 more years. But the morning of her 7th day in the ICU, the morning we'd begun to make arrangements to get her back home to her own bed and her own doctors, a moment after my stepfather left her bedside for the first time in a week, a doctor appeared at the door of her room and waved me into the hallway. There had been developments. Her lungs had been slowly disintegrating for 5 years. Now they were coming apart. One had a hole in it that was getting bigger, and there would be no going home. This was it. The doctor told me he needed a medical directive from my mother, and he needed it now. Can I get my stepfather? No, a medical directive now. So it fell to me to tell my mother that she was going to die and lay out her limited options. She could have a tube put down her throat and be hooked up to a machine that would breathe for her and last maybe 2 days in a drug-induced coma, just long enough for her other 2 sons to get to Tucson and say goodbye, but she wouldn't know they were there. She could wear an oxygen mask that violently forced air into her lungs and live for maybe 6 more hours. Or she could take the mask off and go, now. No mask, she said. No tube, now. I told the doctor, And then I ran to the ICU's waiting room to get my stepfather, my sister, and my aunt. Come, now, hurry. My mom didn't go into the hospital expecting to die, and she was not ready to go. When we were all at her bedside, she arched an eyebrow, shook her head, and said, "Shit." My mother used profanity sparingly and then only in quotation marks. What she meant was, the kind of person who casually uses profanity might be inclined to do so at a moment like this. But I am not the kind of person who uses profanity casually. I am a Catholic grandmother, and I certainly wouldn't utter a profanity at a moment like this. But if I were the kind of person who used profanity, shit might be the word I would use right now. But I'm not that kind of person. It was a joke. On her deathbed, she was trying to make us feel better. A priest arrived and performed last rites, and it helped her brace for what she knew would be an extremely painful final few moments. I could see it help. I could see the comfort the sacrament gave her. It gave me comfort. The priest led us in prayers my mother and I both learned at St. Ignatius as children, prayers that filled that terrible silence and solemnized that awful moment. Then my mother told us she would be with us always, looking down on us, and that we would see her again. She didn't say in heaven, but that is what she meant. Then she made her last request: remember me. Keep me in your thoughts, Daniel. One of the cards in the backs of the pews at St. James is addressed to non-practicing Catholics. "Welcome back" is printed in large letters across the top of the card. Are you a Catholic who's been away from the church? Welcome back classes are designed to help people return to the sacraments and regular church attendance. A return to the sacraments. I've fantasized about returning to the sacrament of confession. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. It's been 29 years since my last confession. I hope you packed a lunch. I want so badly for there to be a heaven, and I want her to be looking down on me, though, and I say this as a professional sex advice columnist, not all the time. There are things that a mother has a right not to know, my mom used to say. But honestly, Catholicism tempts me. I wouldn't be wasting so much time in St. James if it didn't. My boyfriend wouldn't have found a welcome back card in the back pocket of my jeans if it didn't. But when I am tempted, when I feel like maybe I could go through the motions, return to the sacraments, take what comfort I can, the Pope goes to Africa and says that condoms spread AIDS. Or an archbishop in Brazil excommunicates a Catholic mother for getting her 9-year-old daughter a life-saving abortion, but not the Catholic father that raped the 9-year-old daughter. Or I contemplate how the church views me and the two people I love most in this world, my boyfriend of 14 years and our 11-year-old son, and I think, I can't even fake this. But there I sit at St. James 2 or 3 times a week, being brought up in a faith built around a guy jumping out of his tomb. That can make it difficult to reconcile oneself to the permanence of death, to get over it. The afterlife. It's cruel, really, when you think about it. Criminal. Telling children that the people they love don't really die, that there's some other life, some better place, a place without pulmonary fibrosis, or Tucson, Arizona. No offense, Tucson. And maybe that lie is a comfort for some, but it's made death more painful for me, not less. The opposite of the intended effect of religion, I believe. The voice of unreason in my head, the voice of nuns back at St. Ignatius, says, "She lives in heaven." And then the voice of reason, which sounds a lot like Christopher Hitchens, barks, "No, she doesn't. She is dead. Get over it already." This inability to reconcile myself to death hasn't been good for me. I visit St. James like an addict drops by a crack house for a fix, to deaden the pain by losing myself in the fantasy that she lives and that we will be together again. There's an inscription on the ceiling of St. James. I am in your midst. If I were the kind of person who could believe, now would be a good time to believe. But I'm not that kind of person. Shit. Thank you.
Dan Savage. Editor of the weekly paper The Stranger, sex advice columnist, host of one of the most entertaining podcasts out there, the Savage Love Podcast. A couple of weeks ago, as we were preparing for today's broadcast, I was in Baltimore visiting my dad, and I'd been going over drafts of the stories for today's show, including Dan's, and I was visiting my dad in Baltimore, and my dad, by the way, is watching tonight in Baltimore at the AMC Owings Mills 17. Hello there, Dad. And my dad showed me how he had digitized all of our old family videos, which apparently is a really great project if you're retired. And among the videos was footage from one of our very first live shows. We'd just barely been on the air at all. And it was Valentine's Day in 1998. It was a slightly smaller audience than we have today. It was at a bar, the Empty Bottle on Western in Chicago. The Empty Bottle's reach is that big that I'm in a theater in New York City, and all right, their power is huge. Anyway, so I'm looking through. So he had footage. He had filmed the thing, and there was this footage that I didn't even know existed and had never seen. And on stage was me and my mom. My mom died 5 years ago. She was a marriage therapist, and she was giving Valentine's Day relationship advice. And on stage with her was Dan Savage, who was giving relationship and sex advice. And then at some point, Dan introduces a guest of his own. Let's roll that.
Judy Savage Sobiesk, everybody.
Mrs. Savage, I want you to just help out by reading some questions with me. So why don't you start with that one? Because
Thank God for trifocals. Why are men typically aroused more by seeing naked bodies and women are typically more aroused by reading about them? Is it social or genetic?
Yeah, the thing that I learned watching this is that Dan and I made our moms take part in a really dirty show. That's like the cleanest question we got. I'm going to play you one more clip from this show, and I just want to say to my sister-in-law, Suzanne, who's watching this with my nephews and nieces, and anybody with kids with them, cover their ears right now, okay? My mom was actually answering that question about what turns men on and women on. There's a little section about porn and men and women's reaction to porn, and then we get to this moment. Let's see that footage.
And you know what a woman's most important sex organ is? It's the one between her ears. So if you can make love to her head, what?
How do you get your dick in there?
You heard what he said, right? I know that's really dirty. That's our dead moms, okay? So what are you going to say?